Lecture 15. God, the Argument from Existence.
Last lecture, we discussed problems with the traditional concept of God as a perfect being. Some of his attributes seem to be incompatible with each other, and sometimes even with themselves. As a result, some theists have abandoned the traditional definition of God in favor of one that de-emphasizes his perfection, maintaining that, for example, he is not all-powerful or not all-good. But some theists double down on God's perfection. In fact, they think the existence of a perfect being can be proven, and the argument they cite doesn't work for any other kind of being. It doesn't just point to a general creator or designer like the arguments we will consider later. No, they think that they can establish that a perfect being exists by definition. In the same way it is true that triangles have three sides, they say that it is true that a perfect being exists. So the God we're going to be talking about today is the traditional God, the perfect being, the one that philosophers and theologians were inspired to believe in by Plato's demiurge. The argument is called the ontological argument, or the argument from existence. The advantage of the ontological argument is that it is purely conceptual. You don't have to observe anything in the world to know whether or not its premises are true. It is a completely conceptual argument. In addition, it's a deductive argument. The conclusion of a sound deductive argument is guaranteed. This is unlike inductive arguments, like you find in science, where even if the arguments are good, the conclusions are likely but not 100% proven. So if the ontological argument works, God's existence is a done deal. It's proven. There will no longer be a need for faith, that is, for belief without evidence. The case will be closed. Constructing a sound deductive argument, however, especially one with such a grandiose conclusion, is a difficult task. And, as we shall shortly see, the ontological argument likely falls short. This doesn't mean that the argument isn't ingenious. As philosopher William Rowe suggests, perhaps no other argument in the history of thought has raised so many basic philosophical questions and stimulated so much hard thought. In addition, it is the most metaphysical of the arguments for God's existence. So considering it in our metaphysics course is a must. Unfortunately, the ontological argument is also the hardest argument to comprehend. But I actually gained a reputation in graduate school for being able to explain this argument well, so hopefully I can make it clear. Okay, here we go. The argument was first put forth by Anselm, a medieval Benedictine monk who served as Archbishop of Canterbury from 1093 to 1109. In a nutshell, he suggests that God must exist because to believe that God doesn't exist, to conceive of God as not existing, entails a logical contradiction. Let's break down the argument piece by piece. First of all, Anselm suggests it's an obvious fact that, for any given object, an object that exists in the real world is greater than or more perfect than an idea of that object, an object that only exists in the understanding. This is especially true if all that sets the two objects apart is that one exists in reality and the other one only exists in your mind. Clearly, a real existing pile of $1 million in cold hard cash is much better than the idea of $1 million in cold hard cash. Next, Anselm points out that God is a perfect being. At least, that's the definition he's working with. And that means, as Anselm puts it, that God is the greatest conceivable being. If God is perfect, then it is not possible to conceive of a being greater than God. It's not possible to be greater than perfection. So far, so good? All right. Next, Anselm observes that he has an idea of God. He looks into his mind and sees an idea of God floating around in there. And since, by definition, God is the greatest conceivable being, that idea of God floating around in his head must be an idea of the greatest conceivable being. But, Anselm says, let's suppose that I don't believe that God exists. If that is the case, then my idea of God does not include the property of existence. According to Anselm, what it is to believe that something exists is to have an idea of it in your mind and ascribe the property of existence to it. If you don't believe in God, you have the idea, but your idea does not include the property of existence. But the thing is, if my idea of God does not include the property of existence, then it's not really an idea of the greatest conceivable being. Why? Because someone could conceive of a being greater than the one I am conceiving of. How? By conceiving of a being just like the one I am conceiving, but also slapping the property of existence on it. That is, by believing that it actually exists. Since, according to the first premise, any being that exists in the real world is better than one that just exists in the imagination, if someone takes my idea of a non-existent God, but then believe that it exists, their idea is greater. But if my idea of God is not an idea of the greatest conceivable being, then it's not really an idea of God. So if I say I don't believe that God exists, then I'm saying that I have an idea of God, but that the idea is not actually of God. And that's a contradiction. And logical contradictions can't be true. So, Anselm reasons, if not believing in God would entail something that can't be true, then God must exist. It's basically a reductio ad absurdum argument. Reductio arguments prove that something is wrong by assuming that it is right and then showing that an absurd consequence follows from doing so. Anselm is pointing to the absurd consequence of a logical contradiction being true as something that follows from believing that God doesn't exist. Anselm prefaces his argument with Psalms 14:1. The fool has said in his heart that there is no God. Anselm was essentially arguing that the person who says they don't believe in God is contradicting themselves. They are basically saying that their idea of God both has the property of existence, because it is an idea of the greatest conceivable being, and it does not have the property of existence, because they don't believe that God exists. Only a fool would contradict themselves, and if you must believe in God or be a fool, then God must exist. There are a number of objections that have been raised against Anselm's argument over the years. One points out that, at best, Anselm's argument only establishes that atheists are fools, that they contradict themselves. But that doesn't actually establish that God exists. Everyone who believes something is false might be stupid, but that doesn't deductively prove that that thing actually is false. It's possible that they all just got lucky, and despite the fact that they are fools, they happen to believe the truth. Maybe Anselm's argument shows that to be rational, one must believe that God exists, and thus everyone should believe that God exists, at least if they care about being rational. And if it gets that far, that's a pretty significant conclusion. But it's not the deductive proof of God's existence that Anselm thinks his argument is. But the most famous objection to this version of Anselm's argument belongs to another 11th century clergyman philosopher, Ganilo of Marmoutier. He argued against the validity of Anselm's argument by presenting a counterexample, by presenting an argument that takes the exact same form of Anselm's argument and has premises that are just as obviously true, but whose conclusion is obviously false. This demonstrates that Anselm's argument is invalid, that his conclusion does not follow from its premises. To do this, he takes Anselm's argument exactly as it is and simply replaces the word being with the word island. If Anselm's argument works, then Ganilo's argument would prove that a greatest conceivable island must exist. But not only does such an island not exist, but clearly the fact that an imaginary perfect island is not as good as a real one doesn't establish that such an island exists. In a sense, Ganilo presents a reductio of his own. If Anselm's argument is valid, then a perfect island exists. Clearly it doesn't, so his argument must be faulty. Anselm responds by saying that the reasoning of his argument can only be applied to God, not to things like islands. Unfortunately, his argument to this effect is not exactly clear, but in essence it goes like this. There is a difference between a perfect island and a perfect being, Anselm says. For an object to be the greatest conceivable island, it need not exist necessarily. It need not exist no matter what at all times. The greatest conceivable island could come into existence. It could be constructed and still be the greatest conceivable island. Thus, the greatest conceivable island could conceivably not exist. But, Anselm says, this is not true of the greatest conceivable being. The greatest conceivable being wouldn't just be the greatest conceivable being, it would be the greatest conceivable anything. Nothing could be greater than it. As such, it would have to exist necessarily at all times. It cannot be created, for whatever created it would be greater than it. It cannot be destroyed, for whatever destroyed it would be greater than it. In fact, it can't not exist at any point in time. If it did, I could conceive of a being that is greater, one that is just like it, but also exists in that moment in time. The greatest conceivable being must exist necessarily. It's not even possible to conceive of the greatest conceivable being without conceiving it to exist at all times, unlike the greatest conceivable island. Therefore, Anselm argues, the greatest conceivable being, God, must exist. Here's what I think is the easiest way to understand this argument. Since the greatest conceivable being is both uncreatable and indestructible, and in fact, if it were to not exist at any moment in time, it would not be the greatest conceivable being, then existence must be part of its essence, part of its definition. This is not true of the greatest conceivable island, since it's at least creatable, and so existence is not a part of its definition. But since existence is part of the definition of the greatest conceivable being, it must exist. Why? Well, consider this proposition. Triangles do not have three sides. Now, what is a triangle? What is the definition of a triangle? Three-sided object, right? So, the proposition, triangles do not have three sides, really just means this. Three-sided objects do not have three sides. Clearly, that is a logical contradiction, and as such it must be false. But that means its opposite, triangles have three sides, must be true. Now, with this example, we have not proven that triangles exist. After all, it could be true that triangles have three sides even if there are no triangles. But what I have demonstrated is what it means for something to be true by definition. A proposition is true by definition when the negation of that proposition is logically incoherent. So now consider this proposition. God does not exist. If Anselm is right and part of the definition of God includes the property of existence, then the definition of God is going to be something like a being who is triomni that exists. And if so, that means God does not exist really just means a triomni being that exists does not exist. Once again, obviously this is a logical contradiction, and so it cannot be true. Which means its negation, God does exist, must be true. And so God must exist by definition. Just like it is true by definition that triangles have three sides. Hopefully, that made sense. The most famous and damning objection to Anselm's argument, which hits the second version of his argument directly, is the great philosopher Immanuel Kant's objection to it. And it is quite simple. Anselm argues that God must exist by definition because existence must be part of his definition, because existence is a property that God must possess necessarily if he is to be the greatest conceivable being. Kant points out that this argument is unsound because its primary assumption is false. Existence is not a property. I want you to imagine a ring. Do you have an image in your mind? Now, I want you to change that image as I ascribe new properties to it. Imagine that it is a ring that would fit on your finger. Imagine that the ring is gold. Imagine that the ring is a perfect circle. Imagine that the ring has elven writing inscribed in its interior. Did the image in your mind change each time? Now, imagine that the ring exists. Did your conception of the ring change? No, because existence is not a property. It is something that an object must do before it can even have properties. In fact, not even that quite captures it, because objects can't do anything unless they exist. Properties are things like redness and mass and charge and being all-knowing. Existence is not one of them. Thus, it cannot be part of the definition of the greatest conceivable being, and thus it is not the case that the greatest conceivable being exists by definition. We can perhaps understand this objection best by applying it to the first version of Anselm's argument. In the first argument, Anselm assumed that when you believe that something exists in the world, first you have an idea of that object, and then second, you ascribe the property of existence to that idea in your mind. This is how he's able to talk about an object existing only in the understanding. But that's not what we do when we believe something exists. If we have a belief about whether something exists, we certainly have an idea of that object in our minds, although, of course, our discussions about the nature of mind probably make you realize that that issue is not as simple as it seems. But even granting that, when I believe that something exists, I don't take that property of existence and slap it onto my idea of that object. I merely ascribe to a new belief that there is some object in the world that corresponds to the idea that I have. So, if I don't believe that God exists, I don't contradict myself because I simultaneously believe that my idea of God both has and doesn't have the property of existence. That's not how believing works. I simply don't believe that anything in the world corresponds to my idea. In addition, Anselm's concept of an object existing only in the understanding is not accurate. If I have an idea of an object, say a spaceship that travels faster than the speed of light, like the Starship Enterprise, that object does not exist in my understanding. The object does not exist at all. I have an idea, and that idea exists. In fact, that idea exists in reality. The mental events of my idea are part of the universe, either a part of my brain or a part of my mind, depending on what you think minds are. But the object itself does not exist in my understanding. It doesn't exist at all. For this reason, it seems very strange to think about an atheist's idea of God as being less perfect than a theist's idea of God. Not only is it not the case that one has the property of existence while the other one doesn't, since that's not what we do when we believe that something exists, but it's also the case that my idea of God really doesn't have any properties at all, except for mental properties. I mean, it's not like my idea of God is actually all-powerful. No mental event in my mind is responsible for the existence of the universe. So again, Anselm's initial argument seems to misunderstand the very nature of ideas, which is central to the argument that he is presenting. Some philosophers disagree and try to save the idea that existence is a property, but these philosophers are in the minority. However, others have argued that Kant's objection does not apply to the second version of Anselm's argument. This is a hard claim to evaluate, given that Anselm's second argument is not that clear to begin with, but the claim they make is that Anselm's second argument does not presume that existence is a property, it only assumes that necessary existence is a property. Of course, it's difficult to explain what the property of necessary existence is, but according to them, it is a property that a being possesses when it must exist, when it can't not exist. Now, it's not clear that necessary existence actually is a property, or at least it's not clear that assuming so doesn't presume that existence itself is also a property. It seems that to suggest that something necessarily exists is to suggest that it has the property of existence by definition. So it's not clear that this solves any problems. But even if we ignore that difficulty, the argument only works if necessary existence makes an object better, and thus a perfect being must have it. But this is not clearly the case. If a glass is indestructible in the actual world, whether or not it's indestructible in all possible worlds would seem to be irrelevant to how great that glass is in this world. Being indestructible in other worlds doesn't make it any more indestructible in the actual world. In the same way, if an object already exists in our world, the fact that it exists in all possible worlds would not make it any better. But notice that we have now slipped into possible worlds talk, a kind of semantics I introduced you to a couple of lectures ago. Some philosophers, most notably Alvin Plantinga and Norman Malcolm, have tried to use possible world semantics to present an argument similar to Anselm's that they believe establishes God's existence. Let's call it the modal argument. Recall that a possible world expresses a different way that all of reality could have been. Something is possible if it is true in one possible world, something is impossible if it is true in no possible worlds, and something is necessary if it is true in all possible worlds. With that in mind, the modal argument is simple. It's possible that a necessary being exists. The concept of a necessary being is conceivable and is not logically inconsistent. But that means that a necessary being exists in at least one possible world. But, by definition, a necessary being is one that exists in all possible worlds. So it follows that in one possible world, there is a being that exists in all possible worlds. Hey, the actual world is a possible world, right? Therefore, that necessary being must exist in the actual world. And of course, that being would be God. In simpler modal terms, the argument just goes like this. If God is possible, then he's necessary. God is possible, so he's necessary. And if he's necessary, then he exists. The argument is clever, but most philosophers agree, even theists, that there is something fundamentally wrong with it. Recall, there are different ways of thinking about what possible worlds are. Some think they actually exist. Others think they are merely arrangements of all possible propositions. If we think of worlds as arrangements of propositions, it's easier to see the mistake. To say that God exists in one possible world is merely to say that you can arrange the set of all propositions such that the proposition, God exists, is on the left and no contradictions arise. That may be true, but a fact about how all propositions can be arranged hardly tells us anything about what exists in reality. All that really means is that the proposition is not logically inconsistent and does not stand in contradiction to any logical tautologies. That is, statements that must be true and thus must always be on the left. But that is no reason to think that it is actually true. And perhaps that's been the problem all along. It's just not reasonable to think that you can demonstrate something's existence by examining the concept or definition of that thing, or examining propositions about that thing. Yet, this is what the ontological argument tries to do. I can define lunicorn as an existing unicorn that lives on the moon, but that doesn't mean that such a being exists. If we conceive of possible worlds as actually existing entities, like philosopher David Lewis, the argument becomes a bit more persuasive. If God exists in one possible world, and that possible world exists just as much as ours does, then we would have to say that God exists. But this reveals that the argument may assume too much to even get off the ground. If possible worlds exist, to grant that God's existence is possible is not to admit that it is merely conceivable or logically coherent. If possible worlds exist, to admit that God exists in one of them would be to already admit that God exists. But that is what the argument is trying to prove. And thus the argument begs the question. It assumes what it is trying to prove. To accept its premise that God's existence is possible, we would already have to admit that God exists. If we aren't realists about possible worlds, the argument still begs the question. In a way, the argument is backwards. It puts the cart before the horse. A necessary being would exist in all possible worlds. So to say that it is possible that such a being exists is to say that such a being exists in all possible worlds. But since the actual world is possible, to believe that is true is already to believe that such a being exists in the actual world. So, to demonstrate that there is a possible world which contains a being that exists in all possible worlds, which includes the actual world, one would have to first demonstrate that such a being exists in the actual world. But that such a being exists in the actual world is what the argument is trying to prove. So the argument has things backwards. It tries to establish that God exists by assuming that he is possible, when in fact you would have to establish that God exists before establishing that he is possible. Or you can think of it this way. What makes the argument seem to work at first glance is an equivocation on the word possible. There are many different definitions of this word. For example, I might say that the events in the movie Back to the Future are possible, and by a certain definition of the word, they are. Certainly they are conceivable because someone had to conceive of them to make them into a movie. But the story is actually logically incoherent, invoking something called the grandfather paradox, which we will talk about later when we talk about time travel. So there is no possible world in which those events take place. Thus, by a different definition of the word, the events of the movie are impossible. In the same way, an atheist might grant that God's existence is possible by one definition, but not by another. If it was clear that the kind of possibility assumed by those giving the ontological argument was the kind that entailed that God existed in any possible world at all, the atheist would suggest that the existence of God in that sense is impossible. In fact, philosopher William Rowe argues that a similar mistake was made by Anselm's original argument. His argument may establish that if the concept of God applies to any possible being, it must apply to an existing being. But it does not follow that the concept actually applies to any possible being. Only if you assume that God is a possible being does this follow, but that is exactly what the atheist would deny. And in fact, there may be reason to think that God is not a possible being, that the existence of God is impossible. Not only is the concept of a perfect being problematic, as we discussed last lecture, but Anselm's concept of the greatest conceivable being may be problematic. Many have argued that, no matter how good something is, it could always be made better. For example, the concept of a greatest conceivable island may be incoherent because you could always make the island better. Just add more dancers. But perhaps you could also always make a better being by increasing its good-making properties, or having it do one more good thing, like create another universe. Some philosophers disagree and suggest that, unlike islands, there is an intrinsic maximum to how great a being could be, but we will return to this question when we talk about the possibility of multiple universes. Regardless, the argument still begs the question and thus fails. But no other argument besides the ontological argument argues directly for the existence of a perfect being. The arguments we are about to discuss, the teleological and the cosmological arguments, point to a great being, but as we shall see, they fall short as arguments specifically for a perfect being. But they still might be used to defend the existence of a deity.